Hey everyone, before we dive into tonight's story, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely want to hear more stories like this one. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I love seeing our global community come together for these dark chapters of history. Now, dim the lights, maybe grab a warm drink and settle in. Because tonight we're exploring one of history's most twisted ironies. A story so backwards, so morally confusing, that it challenges everything we think we know about justice, freedom, and human nature. Picture this: you're born a slave. You have nothing. You are nothing, legally speaking. Then through luck, hard work, or sheer determination, you break free. You taste freedom for the first time. You build a life, maybe even wealth. And then you buy slaves of your own. It sounds impossible, doesn't it? Like a cruel joke. But this actually happened. More than we'd like to admit. Tonight, we're diving into the darkest irony of human history, the slave who owned slaves. So grab that drink, get comfortable, and let's journey into a world where victims became perpetrators, where freedom didn't always lead to compassion, and where the cycle of oppression continued in the most unexpected ways. Number 1. Born in chains. Let's start at the beginning. You're born in the year 1425, somewhere in Europe, maybe England or France. But here's the thing, you don't get to choose where you're born, who your parents are, or what your life will look like. Because you're born a serf, a slave, human property. Your mother, she's a slave too. Your father, you might not even know who he is because slave women didn't get to choose who they married or slept with. That decision belonged to their master. You come into this world already belonging to someone else. Your life, your body, your future, none of it is yours. From the moment you take your first breath, you're marked. Not with a brand, necessarily, but with a status that follows you everywhere. You can't leave the land you're born on without permission. You can't marry without approval. You can't learn to read or write. You can't own property. You can't even decide what work you'll do each day. Think about that for a moment. Imagine waking up every single day knowing that nothing, absolutely nothing in your life belongs to you. Not your time, not your choices, not even your children if you have them. They belong to your master too. Your daily routine, up before dawn to tend to fields or serve in the manor house. No weekends, no vacations, no sick days. If you're too ill to work, you better hope your master feels generous enough to let you rest. If not, you work anyway, even if you're dying. Food? You eat whatever scraps your master decides you deserve. Usually it's gruel, stale bread, maybe some vegetables if you're lucky. Meat is a rare treat, reserved for special occasions or when your master feels like rewarding good behavior. You're always hungry, always tired, always under someone else's control. And clothing. You wear whatever old, worn-out rags your master gives you. One set for work, maybe a slightly better set for church on Sundays if you're allowed to go. No choices, no personal style, nothing to express who you are as an individual. Because that's the thing, as a slave, you're not seen as an individual. You're seen as a tool, a beast of burden, something to be used until it breaks, then replaced. Your master doesn't care about your dreams, your fears, your hopes for the future. Those things don't matter because legally you're not fully human. The law is very clear about this. You're property. You can be bought, sold, traded, or given away as a gift. You have no legal rights. If someone hurts you, you can't seek justice. If your master beats you, rapes you, or kills your child, there's nothing you can do about it. No court will hear your case because you have no standing to bring one. And this isn't temporary. This isn't something you'll grow out of or eventually escape. This is your life forever. Your children's lives forever. Your grandchildren's lives forever. The chains that bind you aren't just physical, they're legal, social, and generational. Most people born into slavery never see freedom. They die as slaves, just as their parents did, just as their children will. The system is designed to keep you trapped, to make escape impossible, to convince you that this is the natural order of things, that this is God's will, that you deserve nothing more. You watch the free people in town from a distance. They wear fine clothes, eat good food, make choices about their lives. But they might as well be from another planet. That world isn't for you. It was never meant for you. You were born to serve, to suffer, to stay silent. And yet, sometime, very rarely, someone finds a way out. Someone breaks the chains that were supposed to hold them forever. Someone tastes freedom and discovers something inside themselves they never knew existed. But here's where our story gets complicated. Because what happens when a slave becomes free? What happens when someone who has been property their entire life suddenly has the power to own property themselves? What happens when the oppressed get the chance to become the oppressor? That's where tonight's story really begins. In that moment when chains are broken, but the system that created those chains remains exactly the same. Number 2, the slim path to freedom. So how does a slave become free? In medieval times, it wasn't like the movies. There was no underground railroad, no mass liberation movement. Freedom came in tiny individual drops, and each drop was bought with blood, sweat, and decades of suffering. Let's say you're that serf we talked about, born into bondage around 1425. You're now 30 years old. You've spent 3 decades of your life working someone else's land, eating someone else's scraps, living in someone else's hut. But somehow, against all odds, you've managed to save a few coins here and there. Maybe you sold eggs from a chicken you managed to keep hidden. Maybe you did extra work for neighboring farms in your few free hours and got paid in copper pieces. Maybe you found something valuable in the fields and sold it secretly. Point is, you've scraped together enough money to do something almost unthinkable, buy your own freedom. This was called manumission, and it was rare as hen's teeth. Your master had to agree to sell you your freedom, and why would they? You're a valuable property. You work for free, you can't leave, and you make the money every single day. Selling your freedom is like a farmer selling his best ox. It doesn't make financial sense. But sometimes, just sometimes, masters needed quick cash more than they needed slaves. Maybe they had debts to pay. Maybe they were getting old and didn't want to manage a bunch of serfs anymore. Maybe they were feeling religious and thought freeing a slave would earn them points with God. The price? Enormous. We're talking about the equivalent of several years' wages for a free worker. Remember, as a serf, you barely earned anything, so saving up that much money could take 20 or 30 years. And that's if your master didn't find your secret stash and take it away. There were other paths to freedom, but they were even rarer. Sometimes a master would free slaves in their will as a final good deed before death. Sometimes a slave would perform some heroic act, saving their master's life, fighting off bandits, uncovering a plot against the Lord, and earn freedom as a reward. Very occasionally, a slave might run away and somehow avoid being caught long enough to reach a city where different laws applied. Some cities had rules that if you could live there for a year and a day without being claimed by your master, you became free. But this was incredibly dangerous. If you were caught, the punishment was severe beatings, brandings, sometimes death. And here's the cruel irony. Even if you managed to buy or earn your freedom, you weren't really free. Not completely. You were a freedman now, which was better than being a slave, but you were still at the bottom of society. You had no family wealth, no connections, no education, no skills except the basic labor you've been forced to do as a serf. You were free to leave your master's land, but where would you go? You were free to choose your work, but who would hire an ex-slave when they could hire someone with a better background? You were free to marry, but most families wouldn't want their daughters marrying former property. So what did most newly freed slaves do? They stayed right where they were. They rented a small plot of land from their former master, the same land they used to work for free, and became tenant farmers. They were technically free, but practically still trapped in the same system that had held them for decades. But here's where some people's stories take an unexpected turn. A few freed slaves, very few, managed to claw their way up from the bottom. They saved money, made connections, learned skills, and slowly built something resembling a normal life. And once they had a little bit of wealth, a little bit of status, a little bit of power, well, that's when things get really interesting. Because in medieval society, if you had money and status, certain things became possible. Certain purchases became available, including the purchase of other human beings. Now you might think, no way. Someone who was enslaved would never enslave others. They would know how horrible it is. They would have empathy. And you'd be wrong. Dead wrong. Because what we're about to explore is one of the most disturbing aspects of human nature. How quickly the oppressed can become the oppressor when given the chance. Number 3. From rags to riches, sort of. Meet William, a former serf who managed to buy his freedom around 1450 in England. This is a composite character based on real historical records. Because most individual stories of freed slaves weren't recorded, they weren't considered important enough to write down. William started with nothing. Less than nothing, actually, because he had to pay off the debt he'd taken on to buy his freedom. But William was smart. He was observant. And during his 30 years as a serf, he'd learned something valuable: how agriculture really worked. See, while his master spent time hunting and drinking wine, William was in the fields every day. He knew which crops grew best in which soil. He knew when to plant, when to harvest, when to let fields rest. He understood farming in a way his nobleman master never did. So when William gained his freedom, he didn't just become another struggling tenant farmer. He started offering his knowledge as a service. He'd help other landowners improve their crop yields in exchange for payment or a share of the profits. It was an early form of agricultural consulting. Within 5 years, William had saved enough money to rent a larger plot of land. Within 10 years, he was wealthy enough to buy land of his own. Within 15 years, he owned more property than some minor nobles. But here's where the story gets uncomfortable. Because in medieval society, wealth meant status, and status meant following certain social rules. Rich people owned slaves. It was a mark of success, a sign that you'd made it in the world. And William, despite his background, wanted to fit into his new social class. Let's think about this from William's perspective. He'd spent decades being looked down on, being treated as less than human, being excluded from society. Now he finally had money, respect, and power. People who used to ignore him now sought his advice. People who used to order him around now asked for his help. But there was still something missing. Other wealthy landowners had servants, slaves, people to do their manual labor, while they focused on business and politics. William was still doing a lot of physical work himself, and that marked him as different, as not quite belonging to his new social class. So William made a decision that seems unthinkable to us today. He bought slaves. The first one was a young man, probably around 20, strong and healthy. William paid the equivalent of about 6 months' income for him. In his mind, this wasn't cruelty, this was business. He needed workers for his expanding farm, and slave labor was the most cost-effective option available. William told himself this was different from his own enslavement. He would be a kind master. He wouldn't beat his slaves unless they really deserved it. He'd give them decent food and shelter. He was providing them with job security, with a place to live, with purpose. Sound familiar? These are the exact same justifications that William's former master probably used. The same logic that every slave owner used to make themselves feel better about owning human beings. But William's wealth continued to grow. His first slave worked so hard that William could expand his operations even further. So he bought another slave, then another. Within 5 years of buying his first slave, William owned 6 human beings. He built a nice house, wore fine clothes, ate good food, and attended social gatherings with other wealthy landowners. When people asked about his background, he kept it vague. He didn't advertise his past as a serf. As far as his new social circle knew, he'd always been a successful farmer. And his slaves? They lived in conditions very similar to what William himself had experienced decades earlier. Simple huts, basic food, long hours of hard labor, no freedom to leave or make choices about their own lives. The irony is staggering. A man who had lived as property for 30 years was now treating other people as property. A man who had dreamed of freedom every single day was now denying freedom to others. But from William's perspective, this made perfect sense. He'd worked within the system to achieve success. He'd played by the rules and won. Now he was simply continuing to play by those same rules. Slavery was legal, socially acceptable, and economically beneficial. Why wouldn't he participate? This pattern repeated itself across medieval Europe and beyond. Former slaves who gained wealth often became slave owners themselves. It wasn't universal. Some freed slaves remained poor, and some wealthy ones chose not to own slaves. But it happened often enough that it became a recognized part of the social structure. The most successful former slaves didn't just buy 1 or 2 servants. They became major slave owners, with dozens or even hundreds of enslaved people working their land. They joined the wealthy elite and adopted all the attitudes and behaviors that came with that status. including the belief that they deserved to own other human beings. Number 4. Owning property, owning people. By 1465, William owned 47 slaves. Let that sink in for a moment. A man who had spent the first 30 years of his life as someone else's property now owned 47 human beings himself. His transformation was complete. He lived in a stone manor house with glass windows, something he couldn't even have imagined as a serf. He wore silk clothes imported from distant lands. He ate meat every day, drank wine with his meals, and employed a cook to prepare his food. He had servants to dress him, to clean his house, to tend his horses. And all this luxury was built on the backs of enslaved people who lived in conditions remarkably similar to what William himself had endured decades earlier. But here's what's really twisted. William genuinely didn't see the contradiction. In his mind, he had earned his position through hard work and intelligence. He deserved his wealth and status. And the people he owned, well, they were just unfortunate enough to be born into the lower class. Someone had to do the manual labor, after all. This mental gymnastics wasn't unique to William. It was standard thinking among the wealthy of medieval times. Slavery wasn't seen as a moral issue. It was seen as an economic necessity. Society needed different classes of people to function. Some were born to rule, some to serve, and some to be ruled. The legal system supported this view completely. Once William became a free man with property, he had the same legal rights as any other landowner. He could buy and sell slaves, punish them however he saw fit, and even kill them with minimal legal consequences. The law didn't care that he used to be a slave himself. Now he was a slave owner, and that's all that mattered. William's neighbors accepted him completely. They invited him to their social gatherings, sought his business advice, and even arranged marriages between their children and his. His past as a serf was forgotten or ignored. What mattered now was his present status as a successful landowner. And William loved this acceptance. After decades of being treated as subhuman, he was finally part of the elite. He had power, respect, and influence. He could make decisions that affected dozens of people's lives. He could build wealth and pass it on to his children. But this acceptance came with a price. William had to think and act like other wealthy landowners. He had to adopt their values, their attitudes, and their treatment of the lower classes. He couldn't show too much sympathy for slaves or serfs, because that would mark him as different, as not truly belonging to his new social class. So when one of his slaves ran away, William hired professional slave catchers to hunt him down. When the runaway was brought back, William ordered a public whipping as an example to the others. He felt no sympathy, no memory of his own desperate desire for freedom. He felt only anger at the disruption to his business and the challenge to his authority. When one of his female slaves became pregnant, William decided who the father should be, just as his own master had done with his mother decades earlier. When slave children were born on his property, they automatically became his property too, just as he had once belonged to his master from birth. William established rules for his slaves: no leaving the property without permission, no gathering in groups larger than 3, no learning to read or write, no keeping any money they might earn from side work. These were the same rules that had governed his own life as a serf. He built slave quarters that were functional but basic one-room huts with dirt floors, no glass windows, minimal furniture. He provided adequate food to keep his workers healthy, but nothing more. He allowed them to rest on Sundays, attend religious services, and even have occasional festivals, just as his master had done for him. In William's mind, he was being a responsible, even generous master. He didn't beat his slaves unnecessarily. He provided medical care when they were sick. He allowed families to stay together most of the time. He was certainly kinder than some slave owners he knew. But kindness and slavery don't go together, do they? You can't treat someone humanely while simultaneously denying their humanity. You can't be generous while stealing someone's entire life from them. Yet William managed to convince himself that he was doing exactly that, and the society around him supported this delusion completely. This is how systems of oppression perpetuate themselves. It's not just through cruelty, it's through the promise that if you play by the rules, if you work hard enough, if you climb high enough, you can join the oppressors instead of being oppressed. And for people like William, that promise was too tempting to resist. Number 5. Why buy slaves if you were once one? This is the question that haunts this entire story, isn't it? How could someone who experienced slavery firsthand turn around and inflict that same suffering on others? Let's get inside William's head and try to understand his reasoning, as twisted as it might seem to us today. First, there's the economic argument. William needed workers for his expanding agricultural business. He could hire free laborers, but they demanded wages, could quit at any time, and might steal his crops or damage his property out of spite. Slaves, on the other hand, worked for nothing but food and shelter, couldn't leave, and had strong incentives to keep their master's property in good condition. From a purely business perspective, slavery made perfect financial sense. William could calculate exactly how much a slave would cost him over their lifetime versus how much profit their labor would generate. The math was simple. Slaves were cheaper than free workers in the long run. But the economic argument was just the surface. Underneath were deeper, more psychological reasons. William craved acceptance from his new social class. He'd spent 30 years being excluded, looked down upon, treated as less than human. Now he finally had the chance to belong to the group that had once oppressed him. But that belonging came with expectations. Wealthy landowners owned slaves. It was a mark of status, like wearing expensive clothes or living in a stone house. If William didn't own slaves, his neighbors might question his wealth, his commitment to their shared values, or his fitness to be part of their social circle. There's also something psychologists call identification with the aggressor. Sometimes, people who have been victims deal with their trauma by adopting the behaviors and attitudes of their oppressors. It's a way of feeling powerful instead of powerless, of being on the winning side instead of the losing side. William might have unconsciously thought, if I can't beat them, I'll join them. By becoming a slave owner himself, he was proving that he was no longer a victim. He was one of the powerful people now. And then there's the matter of social proof. William looked around and saw that every successful person he knew owned slaves. His business partners owned slaves. His neighbors owned slaves. The local nobles owned slaves. Even some clergy owned slaves, despite religious teachings about the equality of all souls. If everyone else was doing it, if it was legal and socially acceptable, if it was just the way society worked, then why shouldn't William participate? He wasn't inventing slavery, he was just taking advantage of an existing system. William also convinced himself that he was actually helping his slaves. After all, what would happen to them if he didn't buy them? They'd be purchased by someone else, possibly someone much crueler. At least William knew what slavery felt like. He could be a more understanding master than someone who had never experienced bondage. This is classic rationalization, of course. William was finding ways to justify behavior he knew was wrong by focusing on imaginary worse alternatives. He was telling himself that slavery was inevitable anyway, so he might as well benefit from it while being as kind as possible. There's another factor too, revenge. William had suffered terribly as a slave. He'd been beaten, humiliated, treated as property for decades. Now he had the chance to be the one in control, to have other people depend on him for everything, to have absolute power over other human beings. Did William consciously want to make others suffer as he had suffered? Probably not. But there was likely some satisfaction in being the master instead of the servant, in giving orders instead of taking them, in being feared and respected instead of ignored and abused. And finally, there's the simple human capacity for cognitive dissonance. William could hold two completely contradictory beliefs in his mind simultaneously. Slavery was terrible when it happened to him, but acceptable when he did it to others. His slavery had been unjust, but his slaves' bondage was natural and necessary. This kind of mental compartmentalization allows people to do horrible things while still thinking of themselves as good people. William could genuinely believe he was a moral person while owning dozens of human beings, because he'd created separate mental categories for his own past suffering and his present actions. All of these factors combined to make William's decision to own slaves feel not just acceptable, but inevitable. He wasn't choosing to be evil, he was choosing to be practical, successful, and socially acceptable, which, in the context of his time and place, amounted to the same thing. Number 6. The hypocrisy nobody talked about. Here's what's really disturbing about William's story. Nobody around him saw any contradiction. His neighbors, his business partners, his friends, even the local clergy, none of them found it strange or hypocritical that a former slave now owned slaves himself. In fact, William's story was seen as inspirational. He was held up as an example of what was possible in medieval society. Look, people would say if you work hard enough, if you're clever enough, if you save your money and make smart decisions, you can rise above your circumstances. You can go from property to property owner. William became a local celebrity of sorts. Other ambitious serfs and poor farmers looked up to him. He proved that social mobility was possible, that the system rewarded merit and hard work. His success story was used to justify the existing social order. If William could make it, then anyone could, and if others remained poor and enslaved, well, that was their own fault for not working hard enough. This narrative was incredibly powerful because it served everyone's interests. The wealthy elite could point to William and say, "See, our system is fair. Anyone can succeed if they try hard enough." The poor could dream that maybe someday they too could climb the social ladder. And William himself could feel proud of his achievements without questioning the system that made those achievements possible. Nobody wanted to examine the ugly truth, that William's success was built on the same exploitation he had once suffered. Nobody wanted to ask why society needed slaves at all, or whether there might be better ways to organize economic production. These questions were too dangerous, too destabilizing to the existing order. The church, which you might expect to condemn slavery on moral grounds, was largely silent. Many monasteries and church officials owned slaves themselves. Religious leaders developed complex theological justifications for the practice. Slavery was punishment for sin, or a way to bring pagans into Christian society, or simply part of God's natural order where some people were born to serve others. When pressed on the contradiction between Christian teachings about human equality and the practice of slavery, church leaders would argue that spiritual equality didn't require social equality. Yes, all souls were equal in God's eyes, but that didn't mean all people should have equal status in earthly society. Some were called to rule, others to serve, and this hierarchy was part of divine plan. Even the few intellectuals and philosophers who might have questioned slavery generally didn't. The classical texts they studied, works by Aristotle and other ancient thinkers, assumed slavery was natural and necessary. These authorities argued that some people were natural slaves who were better off being owned by wiser, more capable masters. So William lived in a world where his past as a slave was seen as unfortunate but irrelevant, and his present status as a slave owner was seen as natural and praiseworthy. The contradiction that seems so obvious to us today was invisible to the people of his time. This blindness wasn't accidental. Society had powerful incentives to maintain the fiction that the system was fair and just. If people started questioning whether former slaves should own slaves, they might start questioning whether anyone should own slaves. If they questioned slavery, they might question other hierarchies between nobles and commoners, men and women, rulers and subjects. The entire social order depended on people accepting their assigned roles without too much scrutiny. William's story was useful precisely because it seemed to prove that those roles were earned rather than imposed, chosen rather than forced. And William himself bought into this narrative completely. He genuinely believed he deserved his success and that his slaves deserved their bondage. He had worked hard to escape slavery, so he had earned his freedom. His slaves hadn't worked hard enough to escape, so they deserved to remain enslaved. This circular logic protected William from having to confront the moral implications of his choices. He wasn't being hypocritical, he was being realistic. He wasn't perpetuating injustice, he was succeeding within a just system. He wasn't betraying his fellow sufferers, he was proving that suffering could be overcome through personal effort. The fact that his success required other people to suffer in his place? Well, that was just how the world worked. Someone had to be at the bottom. Better that it be people who hadn't proven themselves capable of rising up, rather than someone like William who had already demonstrated his worth. This self-serving reasoning allowed William to sleep soundly in his comfortable bed while his slaves slept on straw in their cramped huts. It allowed him to enjoy rich food while his slaves ate scraps. It allowed him to make decisions about his own life while controlling every aspect of theirs. And the society around him applauded his success every step of the way. Number 7. Stories buried in silence. You might wonder, if stories like William's were so common, why don't we know more about them? Why aren't our history books full of accounts of slaves who became slave owners? The answer is simple. Nobody wanted to write them down. Think about it from the perspective of the time. If you were a former slave who had achieved wealth and status, the last thing you wanted was for people to remember your origins. You wanted to fit in with your new social class, and that meant burying your past as deeply as possible. William certainly never advertised his background. When people asked about his family history, he kept his answers vague. He might claim to be from a distant region where records were poor, or suggest that his family had fallen on hard times and he was rebuilding their fortunes. He definitely didn't say, "Oh, I used to be a slave just like the people I own now." And the people around William had no incentive to preserve his real story either. His neighbors and business partners benefited from believing that he came from respectable, if modest, origins. The local nobles were happy to accept him as a successful farmer without digging too deeply into how he'd acquired his initial wealth. Everyone preferred the sanitized version of his rise to prominence. The slaves themselves couldn't write, so their perspectives on being owned by a former slave were never recorded. Even if they could have written, who would have published their accounts? Who would have wanted to read stories that exposed the contradictions and hypocrisies of the social system? But if you know where to look, traces of these stories survive in the historical record. Not in grand narratives or famous biographies, but in mundane legal documents, property records, and commercial contracts. For example, we have records of manumission agreements, contracts where slaves purchased their own freedom. Some of these documents include clauses requiring the newly freed person to work for their former master for additional years, or to pay ongoing tribute, or to provide their former master with a percentage of any future earnings. More tellingly, we have wills and estate inventories that list both the freeing of slaves and the ownership of slaves by the same person. The document might record that John the Miller, formerly a bondsman, hereby grants freedom to his servant Mary, while also listing 3 male slaves, 2 female slaves, and sundry children among John's property. We have court records of disputes between former slaves over the ownership of current slaves. Property deeds showing former serfs purchasing land and the slaves to work it. Tax records listing ex-slaves among the major taxpayers in their districts, with their wealth clearly built on slave labor. We even have a few personal letters, mostly from much later periods, where former slaves discuss their decisions to purchase slaves. These letters reveal the complex rationalizations and emotional struggles involved in these choices. One letter, written by a freed slave in colonial America, though the pattern was the same in medieval times, explains, "I know the hardships of bondage as well as any man, having suffered under it for 23 years. Yet I find myself in need of hands to work my tobacco, and free laborers are both expensive and unreliable. I have purchased 2 strong young men from Mr. Peterson, and I treat them with all the kindness I can afford while maintaining discipline. I pray God will forgive me this necessity, and I promise to grant them their freedom should I ever prosper enough to do so without ruining my family." The letter writer never did free those slaves, by the way. When he died, they were sold along with the rest of his estate. These fragments paint a picture of a phenomenon that was widespread but hidden, common but shameful, accepted but never celebrated. Former slaves became slave owners regularly enough that it was considered normal, but rarely enough that each case felt exceptional. The historical silence around these stories tells us something important about how societies deal with uncomfortable truths. When something contradicts our preferred narratives about justice, progress, and human nature, we simply stop talking about it. We let it fade from memory. We pretend it never happened. But the silence itself is part of the story. The fact that these former slaves worked so hard to hide their origins tells us they understood, on some level, that there was something shameful about their transformation from victim to victimizer. The fact that society colluded in this silence tells us that everyone involved knew the system was fundamentally unjust. They just didn't want to admit it. Number 8. The psychological twist. Let's dive deeper into the mind of someone like William. What was really happening psychologically when a former slave decided to own slaves? Modern psychology gives us some tools to understand this seemingly incomprehensible decision. And what we find is both more understandable and more disturbing than you might expect. First, there's trauma. William had experienced decades of powerlessness, humiliation, and abuse. He'd been treated as less than human, denied basic dignity, and subjected to the complete control of another person. This kind of prolonged trauma doesn't just disappear when the circumstances change. One common response to trauma is hypervigilance, a constant state of alertness to potential threats. For William, even after gaining his freedom, the world felt dangerous and unpredictable. He'd learned that safety came only through control, and the ultimate form of control was owning other people. Think about it. As long as William was just a free man working his own land, he was still vulnerable. Economic downturns, bad harvests, political changes, or simple bad luck could destroy everything he'd built. He could find himself poor, desperate, and potentially enslaved again. But as a slave owner, William had a buffer against disaster. His slaves represented stored wealth that he could sell if necessary. They provided labor that couldn't quit or demand higher wages during tough times. They gave him the same kind of security that his former master had enjoyed, security built on other people's suffering. There's also something psychologists call identification with the aggressor. When people are victimized by a powerful group, they sometimes cope by adopting the behaviors and attitudes of that group. It's a way of moving from the powerless side to the powerful side, from victim to victor. William might have unconsciously thought, if I become like my former master, I'll never be vulnerable like I was before. I'll be the one in control. I'll be safe. This identification can be so complete that former victims become more extreme than their original oppressors. They've experienced powerlessness so intensely that they overcompensate when they gain power. Some former slaves became notoriously harsh masters, more cruel than people who had been born into the slave-owning class. Then there's the psychological concept of just world thinking. Most people want to believe that the world is fair, that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. This belief helps us feel secure and in control of our lives. For William, accepting that slavery was simply random injustice would mean accepting that he could be victimized again at any time through no fault of his own. It was psychologically easier to believe that he had been enslaved because he deserved it somehow. Maybe he hadn't worked hard enough, or been smart enough, or pleased God enough. If his slavery had been deserved punishment, then his freedom was deserved reward. And if he deserved to be free, then people who remain enslaved must deserve their bondage. This circular reasoning protected William from confronting the arbitrary cruelty of the system. There's also the matter of social identity. Humans are tribal creatures who define themselves largely through group membership. William had spent 30 years as part of the despised slave class. Now he had the opportunity to join the respected master class. But group membership requires conformity. To be accepted by slave owners, William had to think and act like them. He had to adopt their values, their attitudes, and their behaviors. If he showed too much sympathy for slaves, if he questioned the system too openly, if he treated his own slaves too well, he risked being seen as an outsider again. So William learned to suppress whatever empathy he might have felt for his slaves. He learned to see them as different from himself, lazier, less intelligent, less deserving of freedom. He convinced himself that his own slavery had been a temporary injustice, while their slavery was a permanent necessity. This psychological transformation was probably gradual. William didn't wake up one morning and decide to become a cruel master. Instead, each small compromise, each rationalization, each act of callousness made the next one easier. Maybe it started with a simple business calculation. I need workers and slaves are cheaper than free laborers. Then it evolved. My slaves are actually better off than they would be in the wild. Then, some people are just naturally suited to serve others. And finally, I'm actually doing God's work by providing these inferior people with structure and purpose. By the end of this process, William genuinely believed his own justifications. He wasn't lying to others about his motives, he was lying to himself. He'd constructed an entire worldview that made his actions seem not just acceptable, but virtuous. This is what psychologists call moral disengagement, the process by which people convince themselves that harmful actions are actually justified or even beneficial. It's a powerful psychological mechanism that allows otherwise decent people to do terrible things while maintaining their self-image as good people. And perhaps most disturbingly, this psychological transformation was often permanent. Once someone had made the mental and emotional adjustments necessary to own slaves, it became very difficult to unmake those adjustments. The human mind resists information that contradicts strongly held beliefs, especially beliefs that justify profitable behavior. So William probably never had a moment of moral awakening where he realized the error of his ways. He died believing he was a successful, moral person who had overcome adversity through hard work and made the most of the opportunities available to him. The slaves he owned were simply part of the natural order of things, no more morally problematic than the oxen in his fields or the crops in his warehouses. Number 9. When slaves became slave traders. William's story is disturbing enough, but some former slaves took their participation in the system even further. They didn't just own slaves to work their land, they became slave traders, actively participating in the capture, transport, and sale of human beings. Meet Marcus, another composite character based on historical records. Marcus had been a slave in a Mediterranean port city around 1480. Unlike William, who had been an agricultural serf, Marcus had worked in the urban slave trade itself. He'd loaded and unloaded slave ships, maintained holding facilities, and helped process the paperwork that turned free people into property. This experience gave Marcus unique insights into the economics of the slave trade. He understood the supply chains, the profit margins, and the operational challenges. He knew which regions produced the most valuable slaves, which ship captains were most reliable, and which markets offered the best prices. When Marcus bought his freedom at age 35, he used this knowledge to enter the slave trade as a free agent. He started small, acting as a middleman between ship captains and local buyers. He'd inspect newly arrived slaves, assess their value, and negotiate prices between sellers and purchasers. Marcus was good at this work because he understood the merchandise in a way that freeborn traders never could. He knew how to spot slaves who were likely to run away, which ones would work well in different types of labor, and how to break down the resistance of newly captured people. His former experience as a slave made him more effective at managing slaves, not less. He knew all the tricks that desperate people might try to escape or resist. He'd seen every form of rebellion and knew how to crush it before it started. He could predict which slaves would adapt to bondage and which would need to be broken through punishment. Within 10 years, Marcus owned 3 ships and employed dozens of free sailors, guards, and clerks. He ran slaving expeditions to the African coast, transported captured people across the Mediterranean, and sold them in markets across southern Europe and the Middle East. Marcus didn't just buy and sell slaves, he was actively involved in their capture. He funded raiding expeditions that attacked coastal villages and kidnapped their inhabitants. He provided maps, local knowledge, and tactical advice to slave raiders. He invested in the infrastructure that made mass enslavement possible. And he was spectacularly successful at it. Marcus became one of the wealthiest men in his city, with a mansion, servants, and social connections that reached into the highest levels of society. He married into an old merchant family, bought titles and honors, and left his children a fortune built entirely on human suffering. The psychological mechanisms that allowed Marcus to do this were similar to William's, but even more extreme. Marcus had to convince himself that the people he was enslaving were fundamentally different from what he had been as a slave. He did this by focusing on differences of geography, culture, and religion. The people he enslaved were foreigners, pagans, barbarians who lived in primitive conditions. They were better off as slaves in Christian lands than as free people in their own backward societies. He was actually saving them by bringing them into civilization. Marcus also convinced himself that his own slavery had been different because it was unjust. He had been a civilized person who didn't deserve bondage. But the people he enslaved were natural slaves who belonged in captivity. They were mentally and morally inferior, incapable of handling freedom responsibly. This racial and cultural reasoning allowed Marcus to maintain a sense of moral superiority even while actively destroying other people's lives. He wasn't a hypocrite. He was a civilizing force, bringing order to chaos and Christian values to pagan lands. Marcus wasn't unique. Historical records show numerous examples of former slaves who became slave traders, often specializing in enslaving people from their own original regions because they had local knowledge and language skills that freeborn traders lacked. These former slaves turned traders were often the most ruthless participants in the slave trade. They had no romantic illusions about the nobility of their victims, no squeamishness about the violence involved, and no moral qualms about separating families or condemning children to lifelong bondage. They'd been through the system themselves and survived it. In their minds, that proved both that slavery wasn't as terrible as critics claimed and that people who couldn't handle it were simply weak. Some former slaves even returned to their home regions as slave raiders, capturing people from their own tribes and villages. They knew the local geography, spoke the language, understood the social structures, and could predict where to find the most valuable targets. Imagine the horror of a free person being captured by someone who had once been enslaved alongside them, someone who had shared their suffering but now inflicted it on others. Imagine the psychological impact of realizing that your own people, your own former companions in bondage, have become your captors. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire phenomenon. It wasn't just that some former slaves became slave owners, it's that some of them became enthusiastic, professional enslavers who made the system more efficient and more cruel than it had been before. They took the knowledge gained from their own suffering and used it to cause suffering in others. They turned their hard-earned understanding of human nature, survival, and resistance into tools for oppression. And they did it all while convincing themselves that they were success stories, proof that the system was fair and meritocratic, examples of what anyone could achieve through hard work and determination. Number 10. The strange legacy. So what are we supposed to do with stories like William's and Marcus's? How do we process the fact that some slaves became slave owners, that some victims became perpetrators, that the oppressed sometimes became oppressors? These stories challenge every simple narrative we want to tell about good and evil, about justice and injustice, about human nature and moral progress. They force us to confront uncomfortable truths about how systems of oppression actually work and how they perpetuate themselves across generations. First, these stories show us that oppression isn't just maintained by evil people who enjoy causing suffering. It's maintained by ordinary people who find ways to rationalize their participation in unjust systems. William and Marcus weren't monsters. They were human beings who made morally terrible choices for psychologically understandable reasons. This doesn't excuse their actions, but it helps explain them. And understanding how good people can do evil things is crucial if we want to prevent similar evils in the future. Second, these stories reveal how systems of oppression corrupt everyone they touch, including the victims. Slavery didn't just harm the enslaved, it warped the moral judgment of anyone who participated in it, even those who had initially been its victims. The system created incentives for former slaves to become slave owners, social pressures to conform to the values of the oppressing class, and psychological mechanisms that made cruelty seem like kindness. It turned potential allies against each other and convinced the oppressed to police themselves. Third, these stories show us why systemic change is so difficult to achieve. It's not enough to help individual victims escape oppression. You have to change the entire system that creates and rewards oppression. Otherwise, some of those who escape will simply join the oppressor class and help maintain the system for the next generation. William and Marcus didn't challenge slavery, they validated it. Their success stories were used to argue that the system was fair and that anyone who remained enslaved deserved their fate. They became unwitting propaganda for the very system that had once crushed them. Fourth, these stories demonstrate the power of social and economic incentives to shape moral behavior. William and Marcus weren't inherently evil, but they lived in a society that rewarded slave ownership and punished excessive sympathy for the enslaved. In such a system, even people who had experienced slavery firsthand found it easier to participate in oppression than to challenge it. The costs of resistance were high, while the benefits of conformity were substantial. This pattern repeats throughout history. Former colonial subjects who became colonial administrators, abuse victims who became abusers, immigrants who pulled up the ladder behind them, people who escaped poverty by exploiting those still trapped in it. The lesson isn't that all victims are hypocrites or that oppression is inevitable. The lesson is that individual moral character is less powerful than we'd like to believe, and that systemic injustice can corrupt even those who have suffered under it. So what's the strange legacy of the slave who owned slaves? It's a reminder that the fight for justice is never simply a matter of good people versus bad people. It's a fight against systems, incentives, and social structures that can turn anyone into either a victim or a perpetrator, depending on circumstances. It's a warning that escaping oppression personally isn't the same as ending oppression systemically. And it's a call to examine our own participation in unjust systems, even when that participation feels necessary, profitable, or socially acceptable. Most importantly, it's a reminder that the most insidious form of oppression is the kind that convinces its victims that it's natural, necessary, or even beneficial. The kind that turns the oppressed into oppressors and calls it progress. Because once a system can do that, once it can make slavery look like salvation, cruelty look like kindness, and injustice look like merit, it becomes almost impossible to challenge. The slave who owned slaves wasn't just a historical curiosity. He was a product of a system designed to reproduce itself through the corruption of its own victims. And until we understand how that corruption works, we'll keep creating new versions of the same old injustices. The chains may look different in each generation, but the pattern remains the same. Those who escape often help forge new chains for those left behind. And perhaps that's the most haunting lesson of all. In the right circumstances, under the right pressures, with the right incentives, any of us might make the same choice that William and Marcus made. Any of us might become the thing we once feared most. The question isn't whether we're better people than they were. The question is whether we're building better systems than the ones that created them. And that's a question we all need to answer every single day. As we reach the end of this dark journey through history's most twisted irony, I want you to sit with the discomfort for a moment. Don't try to explain it away. Don't try to distance yourself from William and Marcus by telling yourself you're different, better, more moral than they were. Because the truth is, we don't know what we would have done in their position. We don't know how we would have responded to decades of brutalization followed by the sudden opportunity for wealth and status. We don't know whether our moral convictions would have survived the psychological trauma and social pressures that shaped their choices. And that's the point. This story isn't really about medieval slavery, though that's certainly part of it. It's about the human capacity for self-deception, moral compromise, and the gradual corruption of our principles under pressure. Think about the systems you participate in today. The companies you work for, the products you buy, the social structures you benefit from. How many of them cause suffering to people you'll never meet, in places you'll never see? How many of your daily choices contribute to exploitation, environmental destruction, or social inequality? Now, before you get defensive, I'm not saying you're as bad as William or Marcus. I'm not saying that buying a smartphone made by exploited workers is the same as owning slaves. But I'm saying that the psychological mechanisms that allow them to rationalize their choices are the same ones we use to rationalize ours. We tell ourselves that the system is too big for us to change. We say that if we don't participate, someone else will, so our participation doesn't really matter. We convince ourselves that we're actually helping by being part of a system that provides jobs, even if those jobs are poorly paid and dangerous. We focus on our own struggles and needs while ignoring the impact of our choices on others. We do what William and Marcus did. We find ways to make our participation in unjust systems feel necessary, inevitable, or even virtuous. The Slave Who Owns Slaves shows us something terrifying about human nature. It shows us that moral progress isn't automatic, that suffering doesn't automatically create compassion, and that the oppressed don't automatically become champions of justice when they gain power. It shows us that systems of oppression are more resilient than we want to believe, not because they're imposed from above by evil masterminds, but because they create incentives that corrupt everyone who touches them, including their victims. But here's the thing, understanding this isn't cause for despair. It's cause for vigilance. If we know that systems can corrupt us, we can build safeguards against that corruption. If we know that trauma can lead to harm, we can work to heal trauma before it spreads. If we know that power tends to corrupt, we can create structures that limit and check power. The story of the slave who owns slaves is a warning, not a prophecy. It tells us what can happen when we're not careful, when we don't think systemically, when we focus on individual advancement instead of collective liberation. It reminds us that true freedom isn't just about escaping oppression, it's about ending oppression. True success isn't just about climbing the ladder, it's about questioning why the ladder exists in the first place. William and Marcus made choices that seem incomprehensible to us, but they made those choices in a world that made those choices seem reasonable. They were products of their time, their circumstances, and their trauma. We are products of our time, our circumstances, and our trauma too. The question is, what kind of products will we choose to be? Will we be like William, using our freedom to participate in systems that deny freedom to others? Will we be like Marcus, using our knowledge of suffering to cause more suffering? Or will we find a different path? The chains may look different in each generation, but the pattern remains the same. Those who escape often help forge new chains for those left behind. Unless we consciously choose to break that pattern. Unless we decide that our liberation is meaningless, unless it contributes to everyone's liberation. Unless we remember that the goal isn't to change places with our oppressors, but to create a world where oppression itself becomes impossible. The slave who owns slaves didn't know he had that choice. We do. The question is, what will we do with it? In the end, the most haunting lesson of this story isn't what it tells us about the past. It's what it asks us about the future. Are we building a world where the next William will become a liberator instead of an oppressor? Where the next Marcus will use his knowledge of suffering to end suffering rather than perpetuate it? Or are we just creating new versions of the same old systems, with new victims and new perpetrators playing out the same tragic roles? The answer depends on choices we make every single day. Choices about how we use whatever power and privilege we have. Choices about whether we challenge unjust systems or simply try to find our place within them. Choices about whether we see other people's liberation as connected to our own or as competition for it. William and Marcus made their choices in a world that offered them limited options. We live in a world with more options, more knowledge, and more tools for creating change. Because the truth is, we don't know what we would have done in their position. We don't know how we would have responded to decades of brutalization followed by the sudden opportunity for wealth and status. We don't know whether our moral convictions would have survived the psychological trauma and social pressures that shaped their choices. And that's the point. This story isn't really about medieval slavery, though that's certainly part of it. It's about the human capacity for self-deception, moral compromise, and the gradual corruption of our principles under pressure. Think about the systems you participate in today. The companies you work for, the products you buy, the social structures you benefit from. How many of them cause suffering to people you'll never meet, in places you'll never see? How many of your daily choices contribute to exploitation, environmental destruction, or social inequality? Now, before you get defensive, I'm not saying you're as bad as William or Marcus. I'm not saying that buying a smartphone made by exploited workers is the same as owning slaves. But I'm saying that the psychological mechanisms that allow them to rationalize their choices are the same ones we use to rationalize ours. We tell ourselves that the system is too big for us to change. We say that if we don't participate, someone else will, so our participation doesn't really matter. We convince ourselves that we're actually helping by being part of a system that provides jobs, even if those jobs are poorly paid and dangerous. We focus on our own struggles and needs while ignoring the impact of our choices on others. We do what William and Marcus did. We find ways to make our participation in unjust systems feel necessary, inevitable, or even virtuous. The slave who owns slaves shows us something terrifying about human nature. It shows us that moral progress isn't automatic, that suffering doesn't automatically create compassion, and that the oppressed don't automatically become champions of justice when they gain power. It shows us that systems of oppression are more resilient than we want to believe, not because they're imposed from above by evil masterminds, but because they create incentives that corrupt everyone who touches them, including their victims. But here's the thing, understanding this isn't cause for despair. It's cause for vigilance. If we know that systems can corrupt us, we can build safeguards against that corruption. If we know that trauma can lead to harm, we can work to heal trauma before it spreads. If we know that power tends to corrupt, we can create structures that limit and check power. The story of the slave who owns slaves is a warning, not a prophecy. It tells us what can happen when we're not careful, when we don't think systemically, when we focus on individual advancement instead of collective liberation. It reminds us that true freedom isn't just about escaping oppression, it's about ending oppression. True success isn't just about climbing the ladder, it's about questioning why the ladder exists in the first place. William and Marcus made choices that seem incomprehensible to us, but they made those choices in a world that made those choices seem reasonable. They were products of their time, their circumstances, and their trauma. We are products of our time, our circumstances, and our trauma too. The question is, what kind of products will we choose to be? Will we be like William, using our freedom to participate in systems that deny freedom to others? Will we be like Marcus, using our knowledge of suffering to cause more suffering? Or will we find a different path? The chains may look different in each generation, but the pattern remains the same. Those who escape often help forge new chains for those left behind. Unless we consciously choose to break that pattern. Unless we decide that our liberation is meaningless, unless it contributes to everyone's liberation. Unless we remember that the goal isn't to change places with our oppressors, but to create a world where oppression itself becomes impossible. The slave who owned slaves didn't know he had that choice. We do. The question is, what will we do with it? In the end, the most haunting lesson of this story isn't what it tells us about the past. It's what it asks us about the future. Are we building a world where the next William will become a liberator instead of an oppressor? Where the next Marcus will use his knowledge of suffering to end suffering rather than perpetuate it? Or are we just creating new versions of the same old systems, with new victims and new perpetrators playing out the same tragic roles? The answer depends on choices we make every single day. Choices about how we use whatever power and privilege we have. Choices about whether we challenge unjust systems or simply try to find our place within them. Choices about whether we see other people's liberation as connected to our own or as competition for it. William and Marcus made their choices in a world that offered them limited options. We live in a world with more options, more knowledge, and more tools for creating change. We have no excuse for making the same choices they did. But we also have no guarantee that we won't. The slave who owns slaves is a mirror, reflecting back our own capacity for both liberation and oppression, both victim and perpetrator, both the chains we break and the chains we forge. What we see in that mirror depends on the choices we make when no one is watching, when it's difficult, when the incentives are aligned against doing the right thing. That's when we find out who we really are. That's when we discover whether we're building a better world or just finding a better position in the same old world. The choice is ours. It always has been. Thank you for staying with me through this difficult journey into one of history's most uncomfortable truths. If this story challenged you, disturbed you, or made you think differently about oppression and liberation, then it's served its purpose. History isn't just about the past. It's about understanding the patterns that shape human behavior across time and place. The slave who owns slaves isn't just a medieval curiosity. It's a lens through which we can examine our own world, our own choices, and our own potential for both good and evil. If you found value in this deep dive into the contradictions of human nature, hit that like button and subscribe for more explorations into the complex truths that our history books often leave out. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, someone who's ready to look in the mirror and ask hard questions about the systems we all participate in. And let me know in the comments, what modern parallels do you see to this historical pattern? Where do you think we're at risk of becoming the very thing we once fought against? Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep fighting for a world where liberation means liberation for everyone, not just the lucky few who manage to escape. The chains may look different, but the choice remains the same. Will we break them, or will we learn to wear them more comfortably? That's up to us. We have no excuse for making the same choices they did. But we also have no guarantee that we won't. The slave who owns slaves is a mirror, reflecting back our own capacity for both liberation and oppression, both victim and perpetrator, both the chains we break and the chains we forge. What we see in that mirror depends on the choices we make when no one is watching, when it's difficult, when the incentives are aligned against doing the right thing. That's when we find out who we really are. That's when we discover whether we're building a better world or just finding a better position in the same old world. The choice is ours. It always has been. Thank you for staying with me through this difficult journey into one of history's most uncomfortable truths. If this story challenged you, disturbed you, or made you think differently about oppression and liberation, then it's served its purpose. History isn't just about the past. It's about understanding the patterns that shape human behavior across time and place. The slave who owns slaves isn't just a medieval curiosity. It's a lens through which we can examine our own world, our own choices, and our own potential for both good and evil. If you found value in this deep dive into the contradictions of human nature, hit that like button and subscribe for more explorations into the complex truths that our history books often leave out. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, someone who's ready to look in the mirror and ask hard questions about the systems we all participate in. And let me know in the comments, what modern parallels do you see to this historical pattern? Where do you think we're at risk of becoming the very thing we once fought against? Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep fighting for a world where liberation means liberation for everyone, not just the lucky few who manage to escape. The chains may look different, but the choice remains the same. Will we break them, or will we learn to wear them more comfortably? That's up to us. We have no excuse for making the same choices they did. But we also have no guarantee that we won't. The slave who owns slaves is a mirror, reflecting back our own capacity for both liberation and oppression, both victim and perpetrator, both the chains we break and the chains we forge. What we see in that mirror depends on the choices we make when no one is watching, when it's difficult, when the incentives are aligned against doing the right thing. That's when we find out who we really are. That's when we discover whether we're building a better world or just finding a better position in the same old world. The choice is ours. It always has been. Thank you for staying with me through this difficult journey into one of history's most uncomfortable truths. If this story challenged you, disturbed you, or made you think differently about oppression and liberation, then it's served its purpose. History isn't just about the past. It's about understanding the patterns that shape human behavior across time and place. The slave who owns slaves isn't just a medieval curiosity. It's a lens through which we can examine our own world, our own choices, and our own potential for both good and evil. If you found value in this deep dive into the contradictions of human nature, hit that like button and subscribe for more explorations into the complex truths that our history books often leave out. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, someone who's ready to look in the mirror and ask hard questions about the systems we all participate in. And let me know in the comments, What modern parallels do you see to this historical pattern? Where do you think we're at risk of becoming the very thing we once fought against? Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep fighting for a world where liberation means liberation for everyone, not just the lucky few who manage to escape. The chains may look different, but the choice remains the same. Will we break them, or will we learn to wear them more comfortably? That's up to us. We have no excuse for making the same choices they did. But we also have no guarantee that we won't. The slave who owns slaves is a mirror, reflecting back our own capacity for both liberation and oppression, both victim and perpetrator, both the chains we break and the chains we forge. What we see in that mirror depends on the choices we make when no one is watching, when it's difficult, when the incentives are aligned against doing the right thing. That's when we find out who we really are. That's when we discover whether we're building a better world or just finding a better position in the same old world. The choice is ours. It always has been. Thank you for staying with me through this difficult journey into one of history's most uncomfortable truths. If this story challenged you, disturbed you, or made you think differently about oppression and liberation, then it's served its purpose. History isn't just about the past. It's about understanding the patterns that shape human behavior across time and place. The slave who owns slaves isn't just a medieval curiosity. It's a lens through which we can examine our own world, our own choices, and our own potential for both good and evil. If you found value in this deep dive into the contradictions of human nature, hit that like button and subscribe for more explorations into the complex truths that our history books often leave out. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, someone who's ready to look in the mirror and ask hard questions about the systems we all participate in. And let me know in the comments, what modern parallels do you see to this historical pattern? Where do you think we're at risk of becoming the very thing we once fought against? Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep fighting for a world where liberation means liberation for everyone, not just the lucky few who manage to escape. The chains may look different, but the choice remains the same. Will we break them, or will we learn to wear them more comfortably? That's up to us.